Well, hey there, this is Ill Factor from beatacademy.com. Welcome to the channel. I'm going to share some music production tips and techniques while recreating Harry Styles as it was. Check out the end result. So I think the overall technique I want to focus in on throughout this breakdown is layering. How layering and strategically layering can go a long way in your productions. Now, before we move forward, I just want to quickly remind you about my Produce Your First Song course, which is absolutely free. This course walks you through all the essentials of getting your ideas from your head out onto the computer so that you can share those ideas with the rest of the world. And no expensive plugins, gear, or software needed. As a matter of fact, I even show you how you can access a free digital audio workstation software so you can start making your music. So visit beatacademy.com/produce or click the link below in the description box so you can get started with this course and start making music right away. When I first heard the riff that we hear the song start off with, I immediately felt familiar with that sound because it was like this old 60s, 70s type of organ called the farfisa. And I'm not even sure if I'm saying it right, but the farfisa was a really cool sounding organ. It had a very distinct sound. So I figured, well, why don't I just start there? And that way I have a easy foundation to build off of. So I use the Arturia Farfisa 5 and just the default organ that comes up. But there's a couple things that I'm doing here for just a tweak. Now, again, it's not necessarily about, here's the patch, guys, go ahead, dial it, and there you go. What I ended up doing was actually layering and using the tremolo and the chorus effects that are on there. By default, these little sliders are off. So what gives a lot of the movement in these type of organs is the chorus and the vibrato that you can add on there. And that really helps in just creating that movement that we hear from the song. Also, just layering it, because you have the multiple layers of sounds and instruments that you can do. So by enabling some of these, you have them in octaves. So you have the flute playing the higher octave, the oboe an octave lower, and then the strings. And that's it, just kind of starting with there. But here's where layering can really go a long way. I'm going to go ahead and layer that with a wavetable, just a 2 oscillator synth. And I'm going for something that can really accent the pluckiness of that sound. So I'm going to have a 2 oscillators turned on here, and they're going to both be set to a sawtooth. And what we're going to do is we're going to lower the frequency and really bring up the resonance so we really accent and peak and resonate a certain frequency here. Now we're getting that type of plucky sound by routing our cutoff frequency to envelope 2. And envelope 2 is now shaped in the sense where we're lowering the sustain of the envelope and bringing the decayed sound as well. Now, that alone, it's fine. But when you use that pluckiness, you accent some of that, the attributes of that initial pluckiness combined with the farfisa, it really does a really cool job. And I'm treating these layers as a way to create 3D or depth with these sounds. That's one way that layering could be a really helpful tool in your mixes. You can treat layers as a way of creating this dimensional type or just adding some more depth and giving almost like this feel that the sound is actually popping up a little bit more. And that's what that pluck layer is doing. So I'm grouping these two together. And here we have a bit of compression just to kind of glue these two sounds together. And then we're slightly distorting them with some overdrive. So that's adding excitement there. And then we have our delay set to an 1/8 note. And then just an auto filter, just trimming away and warming up the sound by eliminating some of the highlands. And then I'm taking away some of the low end here with an EQ and just resonating this frequency here. Now this last compressor is actually set to sidechain, and it's receiving the sidechain signal from the kick drum. Why am I doing that? I tend to do this sometimes to add a little bit of this rhythmic pulse in the sound. Just helps create a little bit of movement, creates and carves out space for kick. Don't really need to worry about that because it's not like a bass or anything. But I like the movement and the pulse that it's creating to the overall performance. So let me go ahead and just bypass all these plugins really quick. So just hold Shift and turn them on. All right, next I'm going to move over to the drums. So I've got the drums grouped up. Now the very core of the drum sound is coming from Addictive Drums 2, and I've decided to use the Fairfax Volume 1 preset, or this is the actual drum kit. And basically, how I go about selecting the sounds or the right drum kit is just listening to the reference over and over and just cycling through some of these. And I usually focus in on one sound, such as the snare drum. I'll listen to the snare and how close is this snare drum compared to that snare drum. I always want to start with the closest source material as possible. So I'll find a snare. I might not get the exact snare drum, but I find a snare that has some of the texture and attributes that I like. And the Fairfax Volume 1 kit was that. And so what I ended up doing is actually routed the kick and snare separately so I can have my own individual kick and snare track and treat them with external plugins. So to do that, I simply go to the kick and I check on here in the bottom and choose separate output. And I'll do the same thing for the snare drum. And then what I do is inside Ableton Live or similar in Logic or in any other DAW is I created the audio track here. I made sure to go to Addictive Drum 2 as the input source. And within that input source, we're choosing the kick. And be sure to set the input to monitoring so you can always hear the kick and snare coming through. So that leaves just the kick, snare, the overhead, and the room are going to be on a separate track here. So let's start with how I'm processing the overhead in the room. So for that, I have some overdrive distortion. I love adding some of this distortion to acoustic drums. It really does a great job of adding the grit and the boldness that I'm looking for. Now, this particular ride cymbal in the reference record was very thin. I couldn't find a ride here that I had in the acoustic drum kit that was close. So I decided with this, I'm going to crank the tone on the overdrive, take some low end away, and I decided to add a plugin called Erosion, which is adding some noise to the ride. And that just adds, that noise being added there just kind of gives the feel like that it's more washy on the high end. And so now we have the overdrive. Let's bring in the kick and the snare drum. A couple things with the snare. The snare, I have an overdrive right on there. I'll take this off, and the EQ, and I have a room reverb directly on the snare drum. Now, the room reverb really comes into play as I listen to the context and the balance of the mix, the blend of everything else. I'm going to get to that in a second. But the overdrive helps really add the excitement back to the snare. And then the EQs really just to accent certain attributes. As I go back and listen to the reference, I'm like, their snare's a little brighter, so I'm going to go with my snare and make it a little brighter. And that's the advantage of being able to route these individual sounds to my own audio track, so I have the ability to do that. Now, that sounds pretty good, but in context, when I listen to these drums, it still feels a bit, I don't know, lifeless. And so to add some more depth, let's include some layering. So here I have a drum rack loaded with a kick and snare sample. And this is from somewhere else. Something that kind of added the texture I was looking for. And when I blend the two in, really helps create that depth that we were talking about earlier. So you see how I'm using layering as a way to create the depth and fill some of the body with not just the riff, but also with the drums. So I'm layering my acoustic drums with just the kick and snare sample, and they're all being routed to a drum bus. So I'm gonna start with the glue compression. First, let me just bypass all the processing on the drum bus. So what's happening is that we have the glue compressor starting off with parallel compression. If that sounds weird to you, it basically is allowing me to blend a little bit of the dry signal and the compressed wet signal together. I'm doing that by using the dry and wet knob here. Too much and you get, it's just too slammed. So the way I do parallel compression is I leave it at 100%. I do something extreme, right? And I get this nice slam that I'm looking for. Then I use the dry and wet to dial it back. And then I'm using a drum bus plugin, which is adding some of the drive and crunching the mid-range here. And it has a transient shaper. So I can really accentuate those ride cymbals, like I hear in the reference, by turning the sustain of this transient up. And if I move to the left, it's going to make it a bit shorter. So I'm emphasizing more on the attack. And a little bit of the low-end harmonics, right? To give some nice boom to the low end. And this is at 35%. So I'm just really kind of dialing this in a little bit. And then a saturator. And I'm treating this almost like a tape machine. So I'm using the saturator to record these drums with some analog warmth. So I'm just giving a little bit of drive here, 4 dB up, and I'm running the output down -4 to balance it. An EQ to shape the overall sonic balance here with everything else. And then this stock compressor here, just to really control any of the peaks. So I'm doing maybe a dB or 2 of reduction. Now, going back to that snare drum really quickly, I have the Valhalla Room on there. So I have just a room reverb directly on the snare drum. And what I'm doing is, this is what's going to give a little bit more width from that snare drum as I start to blend more and more items into the mix. But without it, so this helps just create more of the snare drum room, you know, and it just widens up that. And I'm using this, how I gauge it is not with the drum soloed, but I really just wait till I get everything in there. Then I put this on and I just move this up to taste, to be like, okay, now I feel the width of the snare in the mix. And then next is the bass. And for this, I'm using IK Multimedia's Moto Bass, have it set to 60s P bass. Didn't actually do anything else to this, but just like brought up the muting just a little bit so the strings get muted. It's set to the finger. And here's another instance of layering. So I'm using the drum bus actually to add some distortion and crunch a little to the bass, but just a little bit. I'm using the transient also to kind of focus on the attack more than the sustain, and an EQ to just eliminate some of the high end from the bass. Now, I'm also going to layer this bass by sending the bass and send C over here to return track C, which has an overdrive plugin set to 100% wet. I'm just blending these two because then this is going to kind of enrich in some of the high-mid harmonics, and I can blend this in and out in the mix to help the bass kind of stick out a little bit more in the mix. All right, now let's focus on the pads. So I'm doing 2 different pads here. I'm going to start with the first one. When listening to it, it's not very bright. So I'm not going to start with a sawtooth or even a square wave. I might want to start with something like a sine or a triangle. And those are the 4 basic waveforms that you typically start off with when using synthesis, right? So I'm going to start here with 2 oscillators, one set to a sine wave and the other one set to a triangle wave. And the second oscillator is set to a whole octave higher. So this is the actual sound. Now, in order to get some of that movement, what we're doing is I'm routing the pitch of oscillator 2, hitting this, and I'm routing the pitch to LFO 1. And so that's going to allow me to modulate the the movement, so the pitch will go up and down. And I have it set to unison mode, set to classic. So that's going to create some more voices and spread that out a little bit. And then just bringing the filter frequency down and resonating a certain frequency here. With a little bit of filter drive, but it's pretty straightforward. Oscillator 1 and just kind of blending this 2 here. I had the sub oscillator here, but I'm not actually going to end up using it. And now we're adding a delay set to ping pong, so we have the left and right action going on here, and then some space with the hybrid reverb. And I like this reverb because I can EQ the actual reverb signal, making sure that none of the low mids really start to resonate and get muddied up in the mix. And then a filter to just kind of hide and blanket all those sounds together. The second pad, we're going to also use a wavetable, same approach here, but this is going to be brighter. And so I'm going to use 2 oscillators set to a sawtooth, and we're going to have the amp envelope, right? We're going to give a nice slow attack here. We're going to use the unison so that we have some multiple voices. It gives us a nice lush width there. And I'm going to bring the cutoff frequency down. We don't want nothing too bright, but yet we do want that lushness to be really, to fill in the gaps in the background here. So simple little delay, just a pinch of that, set to a quarter note, some reverb here, the hybrid reverb once again, and a filter. The filter is pretty much not really being used here since I'm using mostly the filter on the synth to just dull out the sound. Now put these two together. And then next, I'm using Native Instruments electric guitar as just a guitar to just continuously chugging and playing an 8th note pattern here. So using the electric vintage. It's the same exact way that the preset is loaded. I'm just routing a little bit of delay and reverb from A and return B. So I'm using the echo plugin on A set to every 8th note. That's going to help just get a little bit more life there with the width. And then using the reverb on return track B, the big room preset from Ableton Live. Now you notice that these, you've got the bass, riff, pads, they're all going to the D return track. And what I have here is I'm doing some parallel compression. So I'm using Rough Rider 3, which is a free compressor. It's a great plugin. And I'm just really kind of exaggerating the compression here. I'm just squashing this. And then I'm just layering and blending the compressed and distorted signal because I have a pedal here doing some distortion. I'm blending that in with the rest of the mix. So let me just listen to this. That's the return track signal. And then we'll just start blending that in with everybody else. It helps fill in and give a little bit lift and body to the overall blend. Well, I hope this video was helpful and encouraging in any way. I hope some of the tips I shared you can implement and use in your projects today. That's what this channel is for, to encourage you and inspire you to produce music. Now, if you're looking for professional guidance with producing your own music, or you've been looking for a way to take your music to the next level, well, then I want to encourage you to visit beatacademy.com and become a Beat Academy Pro member today. You'll be able to access all of the courses that I have available that walk you through every aspect of not only producing your music, but how you actually make success with the music that you're creating. Then there's a built-in community so that you can have the accountability that you are looking for. Not only do we have that accountability, but there's opportunities where I'm listening to your music, giving you feedback, And there's where that mentorship opportunity is from. So we've got all that intertwined in the Beat Academy membership. I want to encourage you to visit beatacademy.com and be a pro member today, like thousands of other music producers and artists who have been able to take their music to the next level. So I'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.